Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everybody. I'm François Vigneault and I'm going to be your host for our final panel of the 2021 Montreal Comics Art Festival, Festival de bande dessinée de Montréal. I'm very happy and proud to be here to present to you Afterlives and Alternate Worlds, which is a discussion with four incredibly talented creators, and I can't wait to get them on screen so we can all start talking. So just without any further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce them. The first is Aminder Dhaliwal. She's a cartoonist and animator from Brampton, Ontario. Her graphic novels include the Ignatz Award-nominated Woman World and the recently released Cyclopedia Exotica. She now lives in Los Angeles, where she has directed, storyboarded, and written for Disney TV Animation, Cartoon Network, and Nickelodeon. Next up, we have Trung Nguyen, aka Trungles, a Vietnamese-American comic book artist and storyteller from Minnesota. In addition to his first original graphic novel, which was released in 2020, The Magic Fish, Trung has also had work published by Oni Press, Boom Studios, and Image Comics. Next, we have Desa Wallander. She is a Swedish cartoonist living and working in Stockholm. She's the creator of the comic strip Slowly Dying, which features characters that also appear in collections, such as The Nature of Nature and Becoming Horses. Her work has also been featured in various anthologies, such as Now, Kuss, Drunken Boat, and No Brow Magazine. And last but not least, we have Michael DeForge. Michael is a Canadian comic book artist and illustrator, and the creator of many graphic novels, serials, and story collections, including Leaving Richards Valley, Ant Colony, Styx Angelica, and most recently, Heaven No Hell. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hey.
So the theme of today is Afterlives and Alternate Worlds. And this was proposed by my colleague, Alyssa. And I thought it was just such an interesting and fascinating way of looking at your four disparate and varied bodies of work. And at first I was like, like a lot of people, I think I was scratching my head. I was like, Afterlives and Alternate Worlds, what is this going to be about? But the more I was digging into your work and the more I was looking at it, the more I was like, oh, I think I can kind of see different things that rhyme between these different stories. They all feel like maybe they are stories that are using magic or a new world belief, myths to understand the world that we're in. And then I think even more radically and interestingly is the idea that these stories might be changing the world and making a different world kind of appear and kind of creating something from that. And so I'll start just with on the kind of that first aspect of it, understanding this world, kind of reflecting the world. And I wonder, Trung, do you think we can start with you? Your book, The Magic Fish, uses fairy tales, fantasy, the art of storytelling to kind of, I don't know, explore family, explore like moving to a new place, the immigration story, all those different experiences. Can you talk a little bit about why you were intrigued by the idea of like alternate worlds, of a different way of being to kind of express the story that you were trying to tell?
Sure. I have always really loved fairy tales because of how simple they are and how they kind of water down a lot of story ideas and story tropes into very kind of like basic narratives that anybody can really insert themselves in. And so in that way, they're quite a lot like people. They're very practical and they sort of change clothes and they change who they are depending on where they find themselves in the world. And that's something that's always sort of drawn me to like fairy tales in particular. And so I became really entranced with the idea of stories kind of like changing their shape and changing their clothes to suit where they are. And also that they reveal more about the storytellers than they do about anything that, is inside of the story itself. Which I find to be a very sweet thing about fairy tales and about storytelling is that you share something with yourself and with other people whenever you kind of engage in the act of storytelling. And so it becomes this communal thing. It becomes a way of insisting that you exist and then you're validated by the listener who's in front of you. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And that's kind of why I structured the book the way I did.
Right, and I can definitely see that, and I like what you're saying too about just even the turn of phrase that you use, where the fairy tales themselves are changing clothes. It seems like that was something I definitely got the impression looking at your work, that like clothing, the way that things are presented, all those sort of details are entering into the story and are part of how you approach it. Aminder, I kind of got a similar vibe from you in some of your work, where it seemed to be both improvisational, where I know it was a strip and was you were doing Cyclopedia Exotica on Instagram. It was being serialized, but it seems to have an accumulation of details, and you kind of get into like even just the title of your work, Cyclopedia Exotica, kind of connects with that idea of the encyclopedic fiction. That's something like when you're approaching a new world and then you want to find out everything about it. Can you tell me a little bit about your process with that? Like how did you approach creating this new world, and then why were you attracted to creating a new world? What was your goal with it?
Well, first of all, I apparently like to call my books very confusing things because I feel like everyone I talk to stumbles over the name Encyclopedia Exotica. So I feel like if I could go back in time, that's like something I might adjust. But I'm glad you saw something in that title. My approach to making worlds is a lot of like world building has to start macro, and then you go in and add the details, and you get more and more micro as you start to figure out rules of the universe. And I've always been backwards. I go micro. I start with the small, tiny moments of life because that's just how my brain thinks. And I kind of make, just little stories on like, what does a day in the life look like? What does making coffee that morning look like? And then as you start layering those, you start getting to the macro. You start seeing the themes kind of present themselves to you as the creator, and you start seeing the world come into focus. But you start small, and that just feels so much more approachable to me, even as a creator. To start building a world from the outside going in sounds really, really hard to me. I can't even imagine trying to create a universe where like full fantasy, because this is an alternate kind of universe where I would have to build everything fresh. Like this is just like, I like the approach because it feels easy to step into, not only for me as the creator, but also for the reader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I completely can see that, like the way there's the accumulation of details and things sort of build upon it themselves. And I can kind of see yourself surprising yourself as you go through the story and saying, "Oh, I see. Like this connects with this," and then it builds to something that's greater than it was to start with. And then you kind of get like more and more an accumulation of details as you go along. And I think it ends up being something really rich, and it's probably has to do with that. So I don't change your artistic approach for your next one. Just keep going down the same path. Can you, for those of the audience who haven't seen it yet, can you talk a little bit about the way that you use like the myth of the Cyclops as a launching point to kind of comment or reflect the things that are happening in our real world?
Yeah, I use this idea that Cyclops have always existed in our world, the world that we live in now. And there's this idea proposed that at some point, Cyclops kind of hid away. And so I introduced the book as an encyclopedic feel where you step in and the Cyclops is introduced as this kind of creature that is being studied. And then the character you're seeing on screen right now breaks out of the encyclopedia to tell you that like the way to learn about a minority isn't always the most, isn't the scientific journal of the day, is not maybe the best approach. And she then leads you into the daily lives of these Cyclops as they struggle with the minority experience and microaggressions that go with that. And then at the tail end of the book, we also get to step back in to the encyclopedia, and you get a sense of a little bit of both the far away approach, the kind of more less emotional, more scientific approach to this exotic creature, and then also the very personal and emotional day-to-day comics of these characters and their lives.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense to me. And then That makes me think also like about like kind of constructing a world or constructing something new. And Disa, and I was reading your book, Becoming Horses. It's also just like Cyclopedia Exotica. It's right there in the title, right? It's about becoming. It's about transforming, and it really feels like you have some these characters who are exploring, transforming, creating. Another kind of link I saw also with Aminder's work is the concept of creation. Like there are artists in both of the works, and they're creating something new. Can you walk us through a little bit like what your creative process is, and because in and how you would explain the sort of world that your characters are living in?
Well, I think probably similar to Aminder. I mean, I'm more interested in like, well, everyday things. So like, actually, when I was invited to this panel, at first I was like, maybe they got the wrong person, because I was like, I don't make like fantasy worlds. Like, this is completely real. This is my real life. I was talking to a friend, and she was like, well, you know, it's not exactly like real life. So I don't know, I think that's like my the fantasy element is kind of incidental. I don't think so much about like world building necessarily. I think it's like it's a useful construct, maybe in the same way that's like that Peanuts or like it's about little children, and that they don't have to have jobs, and they don't have to have like this whole like structure around life that kind of holds them to responsibilities in society. They're kind of just free to like indulge fantasies or whatever, and be playing. So it's a kind of like, for me, it's kind of like living or affirming that part of life as well, and like keeping it for myself. It's like a sense of I feel like I'm just playing when I'm making comics.
Well, that makes sense to me, and in a way, it's just it's like the rebellious element of just allowing your imagination to go, allowing yourself to create a new world, create something that's different. And but I do see the there's so much about creating in your book. You know, there's one of the characters is walking along and meets another character, and the second character says, "Oh, come on in. This is a recreation of my womb that I have created, and I'm never leaving." Or there's another point where characters say, open your eyes. You can't escape reality. We're in the reality. So I see both sides, like both how you are creating another world, but then also exactly as you're saying, you are maybe just putting a different lens or looking at our world, our psychic reality, and giving it as much weight and as much seriousness as we give like maybe our tactile reality or our physical reality. And the way that your work, the viewers probably saw like on the screen, it involves like collage and three-dimensional work and things like that. It's very experimental, and then that I feel that plus also like that kind of this sort of revolutionary element really to me ties in with Michael's work also. And Michael, you're like I was just reading your most recent book, Heaven No Hell, and that it seems to me there's two things that I thought were really interesting. One is that I feel like your work is pushing more and more towards abstraction, while your narratives are tying in some ways more and more with like reality, with like social reality, political reality. And it seems like almost like you're creating a new world from scratch, like you're envisioning like what you want to have happen in the world, or maybe what you fear will happen in the world. Like there's a certain science fiction element to it. Does that sound right at all? Are you trying to what when you're working on your stories, like what do you have in mind? Like what are you trying to get across?
Yeah, I tend to lately I do find there's like a pretty harsh divide between the work I do, where some of it is very much concerned with dystopia and calamity, and some of it is I'm explicitly trying to make utopian fiction and craft utopian worlds. And you know, in like the Ursula Le Guin style, where they're ambiguous utopias, or they're still kinks to be sorted out. And I part of it was a reaction to writing so much about dystopia for so long, and you know, we're obviously been, at least for the lifetimes of anyone in this panel, have been living through you know, decades of dystopia, and it can be exhausting to write about, and also to satirize. It can be difficult because it's hard to really meet the current political moment as things get increasingly absurd. And as useful as I think it is to break down things we don't like about our current whatever milieu, or whatever word you'd use for it, I think it's also just as important to try to envision alternate ways of living. So the utopian stuff is that, and I try to be very like straightforward about what I think could work, because I think that's something valuable that art can do. I serialize a daily strip called Birds of Maine that is probably my most like on the nose version of that, because it's about utopian bird socialism, birds living on the moon who have created all of this new technology and computing, and it's like kind of an alternate history of the way computing and the internet could have gone in a way that's more equitable. So yeah, I sort of swap back and forth, I guess, depending on how optimistic or pessimistic I feel.
And well, I mean, right, like it is sometimes it's more, I often find it's easier for like when you're imagining the future to just kind of like imagine a worse version of what we have now, or just like the, you know, the person stepping on somebody else or something like that. And I always find it like it's difficult sometimes to think, oh, like what can we do to create a better world, or a world that we might enjoy or enjoy being in. And like Trung, that I feel like I see a connection too with your work, because it feels like in your book you were really trying to like bridge a divide, like bridge a language divide, like a cultural divide, a generational divide, and then you're seeking out like a new way forward. Do you see that in some way as connecting with like the idea of like creating a new world, or for you are those really separate and different?
I don't think that they're separate or different at all. I think they're pretty closely related things. I think I tend to imagine new worlds in very mundane and kind of microscopic sort of ways. I prefer to think about things in terms of like, well, like if I had done this one little thing differently, like how different would my timeline look? And so I kind of tend to shape my narratives along those lines. And so I think The Magic Fish in particular was sort of a reaction to a lot of like, you know, you get a lot of immigrant stories and a lot of queer coming out stories that are sort of fraught. They hinge a lot on trauma and the ways that we kind of fail each other in relationships with one another. And I kind of wanted to tell a story that was kind of about not that, about people who were, you know, trying really hard with the tools that they have to connect with people, even though they don't quite make it there. They're like, their journey is kind of the important thing. And so that sort of tends to be the ways that I sort of envision alternate worlds, is what if we kind of optimistically took the best possible paths, even with a dearth of information and with a dearth of tools that we could ideally be using to navigate these situations. Because none of us have all of the tools or all of the answers all of the time, but I think it's lovely to see everyone trying. And so that the ways that shapes the arcs of all of the characters is sort of the thing that really latched onto me for the sake of storytelling in terms of that book.
Right, exactly. That totally makes sense to me. And I mean, I think it's like you bringing that makes me realize that all of your work is all dealing with like really heavy things, right? Like, you know, like the minority experience, the experience of immigration. Also, even in Disa's work, you know, it's like on a surface level, it's very light, but then there's all like dealing with trauma, like dealing with the things that we internalize. Like there's the characters crying with each other. And then Michael, you're dealing with so much of this social dystopia that you're talking about, like we've all been living in, and we're all still in it right at the moment. Maybe I'll just put this out to the group. Like, do y'all feel positive? Do you feel optimistic, pessimistic about the potential of art to change the world in a better, for better or for worse? Anyone can start,
I am
or I'll
a
call on someone.
hopeless optimist. I'm like hopeless optimist. I am like that. I feel like even going to art college and stuff like that, like you had all the cool art kids in like their black clothing and smoking in like the hallways or like whatever. And I was just like ball of sunshine. So I've always been just very optimistic, and I just like focusing on the happy parts, I guess, of storytelling. Maybe it's just because you have to be with these stories for so long that they do kind of creep into your psyche. But I'm definitely an optimist.
I was actually having a conversation with someone last night about like trying to sort out the idea that art can be revolutionary or radical or whatever. And I do think that there are ways that art can be, all art is political, but not all art is politically useful. But to the extent that it can, it can help, either point out inequities that exist or articulate things that for people who maybe like can sense something wrong but haven't had it articulated yet. I do think that certainly for me, that's something powerful that art has done, or envision alternate ways of living. And I do think that, I think there's a tendency to maybe overstate how radical art can actually be, but people can and do make art in dialogue with and in support of social movements that exist, and that's something valuable, and there's like great traditions of art throughout history and throughout different places and times that do speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know that I think
Disa,
about art in terms of.
Sorry, go ahead,
sorry,
Trung.
go ahead. I was just gonna say that I don't think about art in terms of optimism or pessimism necessarily all of the time. I kind of think about storytelling in particular, about how they're used to help people kind of explore the boundaries of their imagination. And so if you have a story that's really dour, like things could be like really quite bad, things could be worse, or you might be able to commiserate with it. And I tend to like to tell really positive stories so that people have a higher ceiling of what their expectations can be. So like if if you're upset that your life is not that great, then like maybe it's okay that you are, because your life should be that great and you should be able to reasonably expect good things in your life. So that's, yeah, I don't want to like overstate the importance of like storytelling and art in the lives, like the day-to-day lives of people. Like I feel like with cartoonists, it's easier to kind of really stay humble because the bric-a-brac of our work is so mundane. And then I've also been talking with a lot of kind of like authors who interact in academic spaces more recently. And so there's a slightly different attitude about like where art exists in people's lives and what they can do for the world. And I'm kind of more on the cartoonist end of things, where I'm like, this might be special for someone, it might not be for everyone. But in terms of optimism and pessimism, it's not something that I think about too sternly.
That's a sure sign of an optimist, right? I think if you don't think about it too much, then you must naturally be an optimist. And Disa, does this dichotomy, or does this way of imagining the world speak to you at all, or do you think about it in a totally different way?
I mean, in the sense that like all arts and cultures sort of influences the way that we see reality, then I mean, yes, everything does sort of have an influence. I don't think it's something I consider that much in my own work, because it just feels like, I mean, it's such sort of a small fry, but it's definitely something I think about in my day job. I do imagery for a news station, which is like a national broadcast. And with that, I can see like very clearly the power of like imagery and how it shapes how people think about different things, and like really like pushes different narratives. So I mean, I don't know, I guess I have that present, but I make my own stories for really like selfish reasons. So it's, I don't know, it's not a huge consideration for me in my personal work, I think.
And now, and I think that both you and Trung brought up an interesting element, which is for all of us, I guess, is that you're working in the comic strip and actually several of you are working in kind of very much like the comic strip world, like where you're serializing your stories as you go along, kind of the stories change and evolve. And I, for one, think that like there might be something about like the visual verbal mix that we have in comics that does allow us to kind of imagine other worlds. It's traditionally been one of the cheapest starts and one of the easiest starts for people to kind of get into and be like, oh, I want to create my vision of Thor flying through the sky. And there was only one way to do that previously, and the comic was really one of those ways. Do you think you can I go around the table again and just talk about since you all have that in common of working in the comic format, like, is there anything in comics that helps or hinders when creating new worlds, creating a new way of seeing the world? Michael, do you mind if we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, it certainly helps. The serialization helps with the world building aspect. Like, I also kind of make things up as I go along, and I don't tend to plot out too much or try to figure out like all the details of the world. I just kind of like wing it usually. I have the broad strokes and then just wing it as I go. And I think serializing helps me with that. I've always considered myself more of a short story specialist, even though I've done graphic novels. And part of it is because it's hard for me to wrap my head around like a whole plot and a whole universe and a whole arc all at once. In my attempts to do that, I usually feel really stuck. But serializing it gives you this sort of rhythm, and you have to meet a deadline, and it forces you to maybe submit something a little half-baked every now and then. But it also gives you a lot of room for surprise. And I think it's important as an artist to figure out ways you can surprise yourself, go on little detours. And that's how most of my worlds get created. And I'll get sick of drawing something one week and want to follow another character in another part of the city or whatever it might be, and then realize like, oh, there's this whole other thing going on that's like I wouldn't have come to if I wasn't kind of forced to meet this weird deadline, this arbitrary deadline I've set for myself. So I do really love the weekly or daily strip thing.
Disa, I know that you also have serialized your work, and it can you talk a little bit about like, but you're also not only are working in the comics realm, but are quite experimental with this kind of collage work that you're doing, the sculptures that show up and pop up in your work. Can you talk a little bit about like the visual and how like bringing those visual elements are helping you to create the world that you're creating?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of corny, but I feel like everything, I've tried to set this like goal for myself to make comics only because I want to, and to make me enjoy life more, and not make it into a chore. So that's like a big reason why I do collage and take photographs, because it's something that makes me go out, and it makes me look at things, and it makes me look at like things closer and find things that I wouldn't have imagined. Like it's just it's more exciting for me to find things rather than like, I don't know, having to like look at references and draw them from scratch. And I think that also I really appreciate that I know that everything in the comics is it's a real thing, even though it looks like it becomes like an abstract thing or like a fantasy thing. But the thing I looked at is like actually real. And I think, I don't know, it's something that's just important to me, even though like it wouldn't maybe like no one can tell that maybe this is like, oh, this is my gemstone collection from when I was 12, and that's like emotionally important to me. But yeah, was that an answer to the question? I forgot.
I think that was a very good answer to the question, and I definitely see the connective tissue there. That absolutely. Aminder, you're working in animation. You're like a multidisciplinary artist, and also like you talked about art school earlier, and the art world definitely like makes an appearance in your work. How like maybe number one, like do you see yourself as a cartoonist? Number two, like how do you kind of view the comic book world in this greater ecosystem of the arts?
Maybe it's corny to say that I don't know if I see myself as a cartoonist specifically, but definitely as a storyteller. And sometimes cartooning is the way I tell a story. But I kind of came to it a little backwards, where I started making comics because I had just this insatiable need in me to like tell stories, and so much of animation is very secretive. I mean, anything in filmmaking is just a lot of NDAs and a lot of like secrets and contracts signed in blood. So I was just bursting at the seams to want to tell stories. And most of my job at that point was storyboarding, which is sequential images, except that you're locked into a camera. And I still have a lot of the issues where I lock myself into a camera rather than thinking of it as panels. But it was just a way for me to get these ideas, kind of just express them and share them with the world, and share them also at that time instantly, because I come from webcomics first. And it was just nice to be able to instantly share and then have reactions versus waiting for months or anything like that. So it was really important for me as an artist to get that experience, because art, I don't think anyone makes art to make it in a vacuum. It is all made to be shared. And then with Woman World, I really liked just the daily strip felt very doable, and was also partially just because I was using Instagram. Like I could say I planned that, but like the medium kind of told me how to tell a story there. And then I really liked the daily strip feel. And when I started Encyclopedia Exotica, I felt that with a daily strip, if you're following characters literally daily, it might be a great way to introduce microaggressions. And one of the things I wanted to play with was that you can take any one of those strips out, and it doesn't feel like much, like it's a single microaggression with like a joke thrown in. But when you start layering them all, like 120 microaggressions later, it's like, oh wow, okay, I can kind of feel that now. Now it has some real weight to it, and it might be more than a microaggression. So it's been interesting as a storyteller. I feel so stupid when I use that word, but it's been an interesting way to express that story. I really enjoy cartooning.
Well, first off, I think that's a totally legitimate way of talking about the work that you're doing. And secondly, like it really sounds like the format is influencing the work and going back and forth. Trung, did you have a similar experience with like the format of your work, like shaping the world and vice versa, or maybe talk a little bit about that? I could see it going both ways.
Okay, sure. So I think my relationship to the format of my work is evolving, because The Magic Fish was the very first long form thing it's the very first thing I've ever written. And it's also the very first long form project I've ever drawn. So usually I think the longest thing I'd done before that was maybe 12 pages. So the mode of storytelling suddenly needed to be very different for me. And I'm somebody who, like, I didn't go to art school. And so the ways that I tend to approach storytelling or any kind of narrative work is that I need rules. I need to know the right way to do things. And I got very precious about it. And that slowed me down in ways that were probably not great for my process. And so now I'm sort of coming away and trying to figure out, okay, how how is it that I can combine my need for structure and rules, but then also like learn to let go of things a little bit so that I can tell a story that is affecting, but also leaves room for like what Michael mentioned, that element of surprise that kind of keeps me interested in my own work, so that I maintain a positive relationship with the thing that I'm making. And I haven't really gotten a chance to explore the ways that it shows up in my work, but I do quite a lot think about the relationships between, a reader and the format of the thing that you're consuming. And I love kind of longer form comic books. I love long comics and graphic novels or whatever. But because it, like books in general, require kind of constant permission. You can opt out at any moment. You can control the timing. For the most part, you can sit down and you can tear through the whole thing, or you can sort of go page by page and panel by panel. There's so many different ways to experience the way that you move through a comic format through time. And I think that serializing something is really fascinating to me, because that the constant permission that's required for that is sort of like on a day-to-day basis or like on a week-to-week basis. And so you opt in or you opt out, and you develop a long-term relationship with something in a really humble way. And that can inform the storytelling in ways that are so fascinating and so beautiful. And I don't think that we really delve into that quite as much, like kind of as a culture, because we tend to like to consume things all at once. We like to binge our Netflix. We like to watch movies. And so I want to be more intentional about the ways that I tell stories within the comic book format specifically, because it's unnervingly dynamic in ways that we don't really, that I feel like we don't appreciate quite as much as we should. And I'm sure like I'm in pretty good company. We're all cartoonists and we know this, but it's hard to kind of like onboard people from outside of the communities to be like, hey, this is a really wonderful way to experience a story.
Yeah, right, absolutely. Like the whole art form, in many ways. I mean, it's it's getting up there. It's getting a little bit older, but it's still really quite young. Especially like in the format was so restricted for so long, and now you all can be creating in so many different directions and so many different approaches. Um, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like all of your work, I can really see being influenced by and like creating new worlds that are coming out of that comic book tradition, but in new and different ways, and like giving voice to a new idea, a new concept, a new way of being. Now, just briefly, because from the theme, like the concept of this panel was Afterlives and Alternate Worlds, and I think that Alyssa's concept came from the title story from Heaven No Hell that Michael did, but that had me wondering, like how do you all think about like belief, like the ways that like belief, myth, religion, your personal way of going around the world, how can that affect the kind of stories that we tell, if you can see what I mean? And you can kind of go from a sort of the religious angle, or it can be just like you're telling your own personal story. But in one way or another, I think I can see that belief and like maybe even self-belief, there's a lot of work like in more than one of your work. There's things about self-actualization, there's things about creating the self as an artistic work, creating this like changing the body, changing the mind. Can you talk a little bit about how like self-expression, self-belief, like the belief maybe in an afterlife or in a world that's different than what we're doing, has affected your work? And I'll just throw this one out there. It's a little bit of an amorphous one, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought it might be interesting.
Well,
No takers?
I'm personally not very spiritual, but I am interested in myths and the way stories are used to organize the world. My personal relationship with my practice and writing is that I'm usually trying to organize a bunch of things that I know are not actually all that organized, and trying to jam them into some meaning or narrative that makes sense to me, even though I know it's all very much arbitrary, and very little things in my life have any relationship to each other or any meaning past it. But that would be a really unbearable way to live. So we all construct these narratives to help make it make sense. And I find if I go too long without drawing or without writing, my world feels very disorganized because that's the way I organize it. And obviously, other people have all these other ways of organizing it. So that tends to be my interest in myth, is thinking of the ways those narratives help organize our lives, help construct our identities, sometimes help construct national identities in ways that might be good or horrible, and all these other things. So that tends to be, yeah, why I'm interested in myth or fables, afterlives, things like that.
I think for me, it's kind of, I'm very interested in, and like part of the reason I started becoming horses is because I had this impossible goal of getting at like the secret of our like inner lives. And I was really frustrated with the fact that, I mean, however you go about it, as soon as you like even just retelling a simple event from your life, anytime like you have to adapt it to language, it becomes, I don't know, something else. So I'm kind of, oh, I don't know if this is like mythology exactly, but I think of like storytelling norms, maybe more as sort of something dominating. I kind of forgot what I was trying to say. Never mind. I don't know where I was going.
I like agree, Michael, what you're saying, that the mythology and identity is very interesting to me. I feel like I'm never, I mean, for Cyclopedia Exotica, it was very specifically the Cyclops myth, of course, and monsters have, or creatures have been used to represent minorities and anyone who feels like a monster. That's not anything new, but I always feel like I'm just trying to capture a tone. That's usually what I'm trying to go for. Is if I get the same feeling when I read your book, Disa, that like I just I close it and I'm just like, there's a certain feeling I have right now, and it's that I want to also become a horse. And so like I just kind of, I'm focusing more on that part, and that's the same with when I do then delve into mythology. It's like, where are the parts which are kind of emotionally evoking something in me, and how can I kind of sit in those longer? And like even in Heaven No Hell, like in the idea that like heaven has like the multiple tiers, I was just like, I want to live in that bronze tier. That I'm down with that, and just floating through space and like bumping into things, like that is a feeling that I am down for, and give me that.
And Trung, do you feel this connectivity between like kind of belief systems, or like the way we think about ourselves and your story, or does that fall on barren ground?
No, I mean, I think there are a lot. I don't quite know where to start with it, because I think like the magic fish is a lot about quite a lot of all of these things. It's kind of about how stories are useful to us at different points in our lives. And so, the story will shift and adjust depending on what it is that we need at the time. And a lot of the impetus for that is, strangely, like, I'm a terminally online person. I spend too much time on the internet. And one of the things that always fascinates me is the ways that like we sort of like, we don't pay attention to each other. We've sort of like, our most contentious moments with strangers on the internet oftentimes are born of, when we've mischaracterized something, or we sort of like written fan fiction about what has occurred in front of us, and then we sort of like run with it. And I think that the different ways that we narrativize our experiences really do like have this incredible impact on how other people are kind of also in community with us, like interact with us as well. And so there's this element of understanding that stories are both this incredibly mundane thing that we all do and that we all experience, but like taking something from narrativization into this process of mythologizing is something that's so fascinating to me, just because it's something that happens so colloquially and so easily with us just as storytelling creatures. And so the ways that that's approached in the Magic Fish are, of course, very optimistic. The characters sort of adjust stories in order to make their loved ones feel more welcome in the space with them. And so it's something that I find to be like that through line between narrativizing a thing and storytelling and belief is much more direct than I always expect it to be. And it always kind of surprises me the ways that we can sort of utilize narrative in order to affect our realities. Our beliefs can really become what shapes the world around us in very in practical ways.
Right, and I find that really powerful, and I see that in all of your work. Like in all of your work, I see a desire to change the way people think, change what people can imagine could be real, whether that is like at the top level of like having like, you know, can we have like live in an anarchist utopia and get rid of all of our rules? Can we take better care of each other? Can we like have firmer connections in our family? Can we self-actualize and think about like the way that we would like to present ourselves? Can we become a horse? All of these I see as like kind of the alternate worlds that you're creating. I'm going to leave it there, but I have one last quick question for y'all. And I would just like if everyone could just say a world, like an alternate world that you would like to live in, like, you know, like an alternate literary or fictional world that you think would be interesting. It doesn't have to be your all-time favorite, but one that you think might be interesting. And I'll bring one up just because it was in our pre-chat. Disa knows that Aminder has a Tuva Janssen book or Tuva Janssen illustrated book on the shelf. And in all honesty, I love the Moomin world. I love the world of the Moomins, and it seems like a gentle and wonderful world. And I would love to spend some time there. So with that in mind, would you guys mind going around the circle and giving me a world that you might want to live in?
I've always wondered, I mean, since we're talking about The Hobbit there, in fantasy worlds, I always want to know like how the mundane day-to-day stuff works. And I'm always wondering if mortgages are a thing when you get your Hobbit hole, like, is there a broker you go to? So I kind of want to jump into The Hobbit, I guess, and see how it functions on the back end.
Bloom County, so the strip Bloom County was a weirdly huge influence on me as a kid, and it's one that I still find very comforting to come back to, and can see like this sort of human animal community showing up a lot in my work over and over again. And Bloom County is probably my kind of comfort food.
Disa?
I'm gonna go with Restaurant, just because it's kind of wacky and absurdist. I enjoy that. It seems like a fun world.
Trump?
I think Tommy DePaola's Stregonona. I want to live in that world. Not just because of the endless pasta and the like kind of, you know, the like hearth magic that happens, but, you know, I think a lot of children's book authors and creators do this really wonderful job of making alternate worlds that are very optimistic. And like, he's someone who worked for a very long time in an industry where he had to hide a lot of things about him. And so in the last 2 years of his life, he came out as gay. And I thought, wow, like, I really connected with your work for my entire life. And here you are, just like another queer creator making worlds that are safe for me to play around in ever since I was a kid. And so, yeah, so Stregonona for the pasta and for all other things as well.
Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end on. On behalf of Montreal Comic Arts Festival, Festival de Bande Dessinée Montréal, and the entire team, thank you so much for being here. I could have asked you a million more questions, and hopefully I'll get the chance to peg you one at a time or all together at some point in the future. But thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
And all of these artists are on. Sorry, a little voice in my head just whispered something to me. All of these artists are very much available on Instagram, especially, where they are all posting very regularly and some wonderful work. Also on Patreon and other spots. So please check it out. I think you will be, if there's any one of these artists whose work you're not aware of, you will be incredibly rewarded if you dive right into it, into their alternate worlds. And thank you so much to all of our partners and sponsors. And stay tuned, because coming up next is the closing ceremony for the 2021 Montreal Comic Arts Festival and Festival de Bande Dessinée. Thank you.